Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, far beyond the convenience of microwaves and refrigerators, beyond grocery stores stocked with endless options, to a world where every meal was a struggle and hunger was a constant companion. We're plunging into the murky, often unappetizing reality of food in the Middle Ages. Imagine sitting at a rough-hewn table, a dim fire casting shadows, and before you, a bowl of something thick and gray, its contents a mystery you'd rather not solve. Sounds appetizing. Right. The smell of stale bread and questionable meat hanging in the air. But here's the cheeky reality check if you were living in the Middle Ages. You probably wouldn't survive this. At least, not with a healthy gut. All your teeth, or without enduring some truly grim culinary experiences. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the moment you woke up in your drafty, often cramped dwelling, your life as a medieval person would revolve around the fundamental, often desperate, quest for calories. And at the very heart of this quest was the undeniable truth of grain-based staple bread's dominance. Bread wasn't just a part of your diet. It was your diet, the absolute king of the medieval table, providing the vast majority of your sustenance and energy. Imagine your daily intake. You wouldn't be thinking about protein ratios or varied vegetables. Your primary concern would be getting enough bread, enough calories to fuel your relentless physical labor. For the vast majority of the population, especially the peasants and common laborers, bread constituted anywhere from 60% to 80% of their daily caloric intake. It was your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, and often your only snack in between. It's like living in a world where every meal is essentially a different form of a carb-heavy sandwich. But without the interesting fillings, this wasn't the light, airy white bread you might buy today. The type of bread you ate was a direct reflection of your social status. If you were a peasant, your bread would be a dark, dense, coarse loaf made from rye, barley, oats, or a mixture of whatever grains were available. It would often contain bits of bran, chaff, and sometimes unfortunate additions like grit from the millstones, or even weed seeds, which made it incredibly hard on your teeth. We'll get to that later. This bread was often referred to as maslin or rye bread, and it was filling, but certainly not refined. If you were luckier, perhaps a prosperous farmer or a craftsman, you might get a slightly finer loaf with a higher proportion of wheat, and if you were truly wealthy, a noble or a high-ranking cleric, you might enjoy the rare luxury of pure white bread made from finely sifted wheat flour, a true status symbol, known as manchet bread. This softer, paler bread was a mark of your elevated position, distinguishing you from the common folk who chewed on their dark, gritty loaves. Bread also served a multitude of functions beyond just food. You might use trenchers, thick, stale slices of bread, as plates, upon which food would be served. After the meal, these soaked trenchers, heavy with meat drippings and sauce, might be eaten by the diners, or, more commonly, given to the poor or to the dogs. It was a reusable, edible plate, which is pretty efficient, if a bit messy. One mainstream historical fact that clearly illustrates bread's dominance is the medieval assize of bread and ale laws. These were regulations in many towns and villages that controlled the weight, quality, and price of bread and ale to ensure fair trade and prevent bakers from cheating customers. The very existence of such widespread laws dedicated specifically to bread highlights its central role as an indispensable staple and a matter of public welfare. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval bread often contained ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, which could cause a condition called St. Anthony's fire, leading to hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. Imagine your daily bread literally being a trip, but not in a fun way, and potentially killing you. It's a terrifying reminder of unknown contaminants. Historians still argue whether the dominance of grain in the medieval diet was primarily a result of agricultural efficiency and caloric yield, or if it was also influenced by a cultural preference for bread as a symbolic and practical foundation of every meal. Was it just practical, or was it deeply ingrained in their culinary identity either way? You were eating a lot of bread, and your survival depended on it, day in and day out. So, your life revolved around bread, that coarse, gritty, life-sustaining loaf, but beyond its sheer bulk. The overwhelming reality of your medieval diet was its monotony and lack of repetitive meals. Few choices. Forget the diverse culinary landscape we enjoy today. Your daily meals would be incredibly predictable, bland, and often, frankly, boring. A constant cycle of the same few ingredients prepared in similar ways. Imagine your week's menu. For a peasant, it would largely consist of variations on a theme bread, pottage, a thick stew or porridge made from grains, vegetables, and sometimes a tiny bit of meat or fish, and perhaps some cheese or eggs if you had access to them. Breakfast might be stale bread dipped in ale or water. Lunch, a chunk of bread and a bowl of last night's pottage. Dinner, fresh pottage, day after day, week after week. It's like being trapped in a culinary Groundhog Day, where every day is a different shade of beige. And even if you were slightly better off, say, a craftsman or a prosperous farmer, your diet would still be surprisingly limited by modern standards. You might have access to more meat, but it would often be the same few types: pork, chicken, perhaps some beef, prepared in basic ways: roasted, boiled, or stewed. Vegetables would be primarily root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, and onions, along with cabbages and legumes like peas and beans, all cooked until very soft. The concept of cuisines as we know them today, with diverse flavors and cooking techniques from around the world, simply didn't exist for the vast majority. Regional variations would be minimal, dictated primarily by what could be grown or hunted locally. You wouldn't find exotic fruits from faraway lands or a wide array of fresh herbs and spices. We'll get to those later. But hint they weren't for you. The reliance on preservation methods, like salting, drying, and smoking, further limited variety and introduced strong, often unpleasant, flavors. Imagine eating salted cod for weeks on end, its intense brininess permeating every bite. Or tough, dried meat that required extensive chewing. These foods were designed for survival, not enjoyment, even for the wealthy. While they had access to more ingredients, their cooking methods often resulted in surprisingly bland or overspiced dishes. Their feasts might involve huge quantities of meat, but the same few flavors would predominate, often masked by heavy sauces or excessive use of expensive, but often poorly understood, spices. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this monotony is the ubiquity of pottage as a staple dish across all social classes. While the ingredients would vary by wealth, a peasant's pottage might be mostly oats and water, while a lord's might include meat and more vegetables. The basic form of a thick, boiled stew was a daily constant. Reflecting the limited culinary techniques and available ingredients, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval recipe collections, especially from wealthier households, often showed a surprising lack of differentiation in how dishes were cooked, with many meats simply being boiled or roasted to oblivion and then covered in thick, spiced sauces. Imagine a medieval chef's idea of variety being simply changing the color of the sauce, not the underlying dish. It's a reminder that even the rich didn't always eat wonderfully. Historians still argue whether the perceived monotony of the medieval diet was primarily due to genuine lack of agricultural diversity and preservation techniques, or if it was also a cultural preference for familiar, comforting, and easily reproducible dishes that prioritized sustenance over culinary exploration. Was it necessity, or choice regardless? Your taste buds would be perpetually underwhelmed, navigating a world where bland repetition was the norm and gastronomic excitement was a rare, perhaps mythical, concept. So, your taste buds were subjected to a relentless monotony, but even that limited range of ingredients was constantly under threat, bringing us to the profound challenges of preservation challenges spoilage, lack of refrigeration, in a world without freezers, canning, or even reliable airtight containers. Keeping food from spoiling was a continuous, losing battle, often leading to wasted resources and the consumption of less than fresh provisions. Imagine your pantry. It wouldn't be a chilled room or a cupboard filled with neatly sealed packages. Instead, you'd have barrels of salted meat, sacks of dried grains, and perhaps some root vegetables stored in a cool, dark cellar or buried in sand. The air would be humid, and the ever-present threat of rot, mold, and vermin would hang heavy. Every day was a race against decay. It's like living in a constant episode of Chopped, where the secret ingredient is always barely edible. The primary methods of preservation were salting, drying, smoking, and pickling fermentation. Salting was crucial for meat and fish. You'd rub large quantities of salt into cuts of meat, drawing out moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. This left the meat incredibly salty and tough, requiring lengthy soaking and boiling before it could even be considered palatable. Imagine eating a piece of pork that tasted like it had been dipped in the Dead Sea. Drying was used for fruits, vegetables, and particularly fish. Fish would be hung in the sun or over slow fires, becoming hard and brittle. Grains, like wheat and barley, were also dried after harvest to prevent mold and insect infestation. But even dried goods could succumb to moisture or pests if not stored properly. Smoking was another technique. Imparting a distinctive flavor while preserving meat and fish, you'd hang cuts of meat in a smokehouse, allowing the smoke to dry and cure them. This worked, but the smoky flavor permeated everything, meaning many of your dishes would have a similar, rather intense, taste profile. The lack of refrigeration meant that fresh food had to be eaten quickly or it would spoil. Milk would turn sour within hours. Fresh meat would begin to rot within a day, and vegetables would wilt rapidly. This limited diet based on what could be preserved meant a constant juggling act of consumption and waste. If you slaughtered an animal, you had to eat it all quickly, or process it immediately. There was no leftovers for tomorrow in the way we think of it. Pest control was almost non-existent. Rats, mice, weevils, and other insects were constant companions in medieval homes and storehouses, contaminating food supplies and consuming precious rations. Imagine reaching into a sack of grain only to find it teeming with little critters. Just another day in the medieval kitchen. One mainstream historical fact that highlights these challenges is the widespread practice of slaughtering most livestock in autumn. This was not just about the availability of fodder. but also a practical necessity due to the inability to keep large quantities of fresh meat from spoiling during the cold months. Animals would be butchered, and their meat heavily salted or smoked to last through winter, shaping the seasonal availability of fresh meat. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some wealthy households, large chests filled with ice or packed snow, collected in winter and stored in insulated cellars, might be used for very short-term chilling of highly perishable items. A crude form of refrigeration for only the most elite. Imagine having a cold box that literally runs out of ice every few days. It's a luxury that barely scratched the surface of true food preservation. Historians still argue whether the constant battle against food spoilage primarily led to widespread health issues due to the consumption of tainted food, or if medieval people developed sophisticated methods within their limitations that generally prevented widespread illness directly attributable to spoilage. Did it make them sick, or just really good at identifying questionable odors regardless? Your medieval life would be a continuous struggle against the relentless forces of decay, where every meal was a minor victory over the inevitable march of time and bacteria. So, your constant battle against food spoilage meant a life of vigilant preservation, but even the most diligent efforts could be rendered useless by a far greater, more terrifying specter famine and scarcity cycles of hunger, starvation risk. In the Middle Ages, food was never guaranteed, and the specter of hunger, ranging from chronic malnutrition to outright starvation, was a recurring nightmare that shaped lives, societies, and entire historical periods. Imagine the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. For the majority of medieval people, living at or just above subsistence level, daily life was a delicate balance between sufficient harvest and outright hunger, a slight dip in yield due to bad weather, pest infestations, or conflict could quickly push a family, or an entire region, into desperate circumstances. You wouldn't think of dieting, you would just be constantly, profoundly hungry. It's like living on a permanent, involuntary fasting regime, but without the spiritual enlightenment, and with a very real chance of dying from it. Famines were not rare, isolated events. They were a cyclical reality, often triggered by successive years of poor harvests. If the spring was too wet, preventing planting if the summer was too dry, causing crops to wither, or if an early frost destroyed the autumn harvest. The consequences were devastating. Food prices would skyrocket, making even the meager supplies unaffordable for the common folk. People would resort to desperate measures, eating tree bark, roots, weeds, or even their seed grain, sacrificing future harvests for immediate survival. The Great Famine of 1315 and 1317 is a stark historical example. Imagine those years' relentless rain, ruined crops, and widespread starvation sweeping across northern Europe, claiming millions of lives. You would witness people dying in the streets, weakened by hunger, susceptible to any disease that came along. Children would be abandoned, families would scatter in search of food, and desperation would lead to unthinkable acts. It wasn't just a lack of food, it was a complete societal breakdown, even when not a full-blown famine. Chronic scarcity was the norm for many. Particularly in winter, stored food supplies would dwindle, and the diet would become even more monotonous and less nutritious. People would be perpetually underweight, easily fatigued, and highly susceptible to illness. Your body would be running on fumes, a constant state of low-grade malnutrition. The fear of hunger shaped every aspect of life. Farmers prioritized resilient, high-yield crops over taste or variety. Communities maintained communal granaries for emergencies, though these were often quickly depleted. Life was a continuous act of trying to accumulate just enough to survive the next lean season. With no guarantee of success, one mainstream historical fact that highlights this pervasive threat is the three-field system of agriculture. While an advance that increased yields by rotating crops and leaving a third of the land fallow. It also speaks to the inherent struggle for food security. The system was a sophisticated attempt to maximize output and reduce the risk of total crop failure. A direct response to the constant threat of scarcity and famine, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval peasants sometimes relied on gleaning, the practice of collecting leftover grain after the harvest, to supplement their meager diets, often a rite enshrined in local customs. Imagine spending hours bent over, picking up individual grains from the mud, just to add a few more crumbs to your daily bread. It's a vivid picture of desperate resourcefulness. Historians still argue whether medieval famines were primarily caused by climatic factors, e.g., the Little Ice Age, or if they were more a consequence of inefficient agricultural practices and insufficient infrastructure for food distribution, or a complex interplay of both. Was it nature's fault, or human systems failing? Regardless, your medieval life would be overshadowed by the constant, chilling dread of an empty stomach, a battle for mere survival that you were always at risk of losing. So, the constant dread of an empty stomach was a grim reality. But even when food was available, it often presented a different kind of danger, bringing us to the terrifying reality of adulteration and contamination filth. Diseases from food. In a world without modern food safety standards, hygiene was virtually non-existent, and consuming your daily meal was often a dangerous gamble, risking sickness, poisoning, or even death from unseen pathogens and deliberate fraud. Imagine your food preparation area, whether it was a smoky hearth in a peasant's hovel or a bustling kitchen in a lord's castle. Cleanliness was not a priority as we understand it today. Surfaces were rarely sanitized, hands were rarely washed, and flies and other insects were constant companions. Animals, from chickens to dogs, often roamed freely, bringing their own array of unsanitary contributions. It's like having every meal prepared in a perpetually messy, uninspected barn, with added pests. Food was often sold in open markets, exposed to dust, dirt, animals, and human waste. Meat would hang uncovered. Attracting flies, vegetables would be piled on the ground, water, used for cooking and drinking, was often drawn from contaminated wells or rivers, teeming with bacteria and parasites. Think of all the hidden dangers lurking in a seemingly simple cup of water. Adulteration was also a widespread and accepted practice, driven by greed and the desire to stretch expensive ingredients. Bakers might add sawdust, chalk, or bean flour to their bread to make it heavier or whiter. Remember that pure white bread was a status symbol. Millers might mix dirt or inferior grains into their flour. Butchers might sell diseased meat or mix in cheaper, less palatable animal parts. Wine could be watered down or flavored with questionable additives. Spices, when available, were particularly prone to being mixed with cheaper, inert substances. You never quite knew what you were truly eating. It's like ordering food online, but there's a 50-50 chance it's entirely the wrong item, and also potentially poisonous. The consequences of this contamination and adulteration were dire. Foodborne illnesses, like dysentery, salmonella, and various parasitic infections, were rampant. You would regularly experience bouts of vomiting, diarrhea, and stomach cramps, while often not fatal for a healthy adult. These illnesses could be deadly for children, the elderly, or those already weakened by malnutrition. A simple meal could send you to your grave. poisoning, whether accidental from moldy grain like the ergot we talked about or deliberate, though rare, for the common person. A risk for the powerful was another terrifying possibility. The lack of understanding about bacteria and toxins meant that even well-intentioned practices could be dangerous. One mainstream historical fact that highlights these dangers is the frequent mention of flux dysentery in medieval medical texts and chronicles. This widespread intestinal illness, characterized by severe diarrhea and dehydration, was a common cause of death and was almost certainly linked to contaminated food and water sources. Its ubiquity speaks volumes about the unsanitary conditions. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval diners were often advised to carry their own knife and spoon for eating, not just out of custom, but also because communal utensils, if they existed, would be rarely, if ever, cleaned, adding another layer of potential contamination. Imagine refusing to use cutlery because it's probably covered in last week's germs. It's a small, gross detail that paints a vivid picture. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of foodborne illness in the Middle Ages was primarily due to a genuine lack of hygienic practices, or if medieval people developed a certain level of immunity or tolerance to common pathogens due to constant exposure, making severe outbreaks less frequent than modern sensibilities might assume. Did they simply build up a resistance, or were they perpetually sick regardless? Every bite of food you took in the Middle Ages was a small act of faith, a gamble against the unseen dangers lurking within your meal. So, every bite was a gamble, a constant risk of invisible nasties, but even if you avoided outright contamination, your diet was still severely limited by the relentless march of the calendar, bringing us to seasonal eating and limitations-restricted diets, winter hardship. Forget year-round availability of fresh produce. Your medieval plate was dictated by the seasons, especially the brutal scarcity of winter, forcing you into a diet of preserved goods and often meager provisions. Imagine your local market throughout the year. In summer, you might see a fleeting abundance fresh berries, a wider variety of greens, and perhaps new season's cheeses. But these moments of plenty were brief. As autumn arrived, the focus shifted entirely to the harvest, a frantic period of gathering grains, root vegetables, and fruits that could be stored. Your diet would change dramatically, reflecting what was ripe and what could last. It's like living in a permanent subscription box service, but the box contents are entirely dictated by the weather, and sometimes the box is just empty. Winter, however, was the true test. With fields fallow and fresh produce impossible to grow, your diet would shrink to a monotonous rotation of preserved foods. This meant heavily salted or smoked meats and fish, dried peas and beans, and root vegetables like parsnips, turnips, and carrots that could be stored in cellars or buried in pits to prevent freezing. Any fresh green vegetables would be a distant memory, replaced by the hearty, often bland, taste of dried legumes and tough roots. Fruits, too, were seasonal. Apples, pears, and berries were enjoyed in summer and autumn. But beyond that, only dried versions were available. Imagine going months without tasting a fresh apple or a juicy berry, relying instead on shriveled, leathery remnants of summer's bounty. The restricted diets weren't just a matter of taste, they led to nutritional deficiencies, without fresh vitamin C from fruits and greens. Scurvy, remember that from the Viking section, was a very real threat, particularly at the end of long winters when stored provisions were depleted. Lack of vitamin D from sunlight exposure during darker months, combined with minimal dairy intake, could also lead to weakened bones. Your body would be constantly adapting, and often suffering. From these drastic seasonal shifts, even for meat. The availability changed with the seasons. Most livestock would be slaughtered in the autumn to avoid feeding them through the lean winter months. This meant a glut of fresh meat initially, followed by reliance on salted and smoked provisions until spring, when fresh meat became available again from newly fattened animals. This seasonal rhythm dictated the very fabric of medieval life. One mainstream historical fact that demonstrates the strict seasonal nature of the medieval diet is the practice of pork butchering, or Schweineschlachten, in late autumn, a common scene depicted in medieval calendars and illuminated manuscripts. This was a crucial annual event, as pigs were fattened over summer and autumn, then slaughtered and preserved to provide much-needed meat throughout the winter. Highlighting the seasonal rhythm of their food supply, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval communities often had specific hunger gaps in their calendar. Typically, late spring before the early crops were ready, when food stores were at their lowest and starvation risk was highest. Imagine having a specific well-known period each year when everyone just expects to be really, really hungry. It's a bleak anticipation. Historians still argue whether the challenges of seasonal eating primarily fostered ingenuity in preservation methods, leading to a surprisingly resilient food system for its time, or if it was a constant source of widespread malnutrition and periodic famine. Showcasing the inherent fragility of their agricultural base, did they master the seasons? Or were they perpetually enslaved by them? Regardless, your medieval palate would be governed by the sun's cycles, experiencing fleeting moments of abundance followed by long, monotonous stretches of preserved necessity, a constant reminder of nature's unyielding control over your plate. So, your diet was a slave to the seasons, often grim and repetitive, but within that constrained culinary world. Your place on the social ladder dictated a vastly different experience. Bringing us to social class and diet disparity, rich ate well, poor ate scraps. The medieval table was a stark reflection of society, with the elite indulging in copious amounts of meat, fine bread, and imported luxuries, while the vast majority subsisted on a meager, often deficient, diet. Imagine the contrast. If you were a peasant, a serf tied to the land, your diet would be precisely as we've been describing: coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley, thick pottage primarily of peas, beans, and oats, perhaps a bit of cheese, and on rare occasions, a small portion of salted fish or the less desirable parts of an animal. Meat would be a true luxury, reserved for feast days or after a successful and legal hunt in common lands. Your meals were about survival, providing just enough calories to fuel your backbreaking labor. It's like having a subscription to the basic survival meal plan, while everyone else is on the gourmet indulgence package. Now, imagine if you were a noble, a lord, or lady. Your table would groan under the weight of roasted meats: venison, boar, beef, lamb, and a variety of fowl like swans, peacocks, and geese. Meat was the ultimate status symbol. Consumed in vast quantities, your bread would be the finest. Purest white wheat bread. You'd have access to a wider range of vegetables, sometimes grown in enclosed gardens, and fruits, both fresh in season and preserved. Spices, imported from distant lands, would flavor your dishes, even if sometimes used with a heavy hand. We'll dive into those more later. The dining experience itself was vastly different. For the poor, meals were often eaten quickly, around a communal pot or off basic wooden platters. For the rich, meals were elaborate banquets, often with multiple courses, entertainment, and fine linens. It wasn't just about the food, it was a display of wealth, power, and prestige. Imagine feasting on roasted peacock with gilded feathers, while just outside the castle walls, peasants gnawed on dry bread. This disparity wasn't just about quantity, it was about quality and nutritional value. The peasant diet, while often calorically sufficient for labor, frequently lacked essential vitamins and minerals, leading to chronic malnutrition, dental problems, and weakened immune systems. The noble diet, while rich in protein and fat, often suffered from a lack of dietary fiber and excessive consumption of meat, potentially leading to its own set of health issues like gout. Hunting was another clear marker of class. While peasants might poach small game at great risk, the hunting of deer, boar, and other large animals was strictly the preserve of the nobility, guarded by harsh laws. This meant the best sources of protein were off limits to the very people who needed them most. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this disparity is the sumptuary laws enacted in some medieval societies. These laws dictated what certain social classes could wear, consume, or display, specifically to prevent commoners from emulating the elaborate diets and clothing of the nobility. The very need for such laws demonstrates the clear, visual, and legal distinctions in consumption patterns. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval noble banquets sometimes featured subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures or edible displays of castles, animals, or mythical creatures, designed more for visual spectacle than for consumption. Imagine a medieval dessert that's essentially an edible art installation, totally wasted on your stomach. It's a true reflection of aristocratic excess. Historians still argue whether the stark dietary divide in the Middle Ages primarily led to greater social stability by reinforcing the established hierarchy, or if it was a constant source of resentment and unrest, fueling peasant revolts and social tensions. Did it keep the peace, or ignite rebellion regardless? Your medieval dining experience was a constant, stark reminder of your place in society, with the rich savoring their feasts and the poor endlessly toiling for their meager scraps. So, your meal was a direct reflection of your social standing, a constant reminder of who you were in the grand scheme of medieval society. But regardless of your status, another fundamental challenge loomed over every aspect of daily life: water and drink, choices dirty water, weak ale, wine, finding safe. Potable liquid was a persistent problem, forcing most medieval people to rely on fermented beverages as a safer, if not entirely healthy, alternative. Imagine trying to quench your thirst, your first instinct. Reaching for a glass of clean, filtered tap water simply didn't exist. Water sources, rivers, streams, and wells were often heavily contaminated by human and animal waste, industrial runoff from tanneries or dyes, and general filth. Drinking directly from these sources was a risky gamble, almost guaranteeing a bout of dysentery or other waterborne diseases. It's like living in a world where every water fountain has a tiny, invisible drink at your own risk sign. Because of this pervasive contamination, the most common and safest daily drink for virtually everyone, from peasant to noble, was ale or beer, depending on the region and ingredients. Why ale? Because the brewing process, which involved boiling the water during mashing and fermentation, killed most of the harmful bacteria. This made it far safer to drink than plain water. You wouldn't be drinking strong. High-alcohol craft beers. Though, medieval ale was typically weak, often less than 2% alcohol by volume, more akin to a nutritious liquid bread or a light, slightly intoxicating tonic. Children drank it too, often from a young age. Imagine having a pint of incredibly weak, lukewarm beer for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, every single day. For the wealthy, wine was also a popular choice, like ale. Its fermentation process made it safer than water. Wine was a status symbol, often imported from specific regions, and its quality varied wildly. While a lord might drink a finer, aged wine. Even common wine was often diluted with water or spiced to mask imperfections. Still, it was generally safer than the local well water. Milk was consumed, particularly by children and in agricultural regions, but it would often be unpasteurized and would spoil quickly. Presenting its own risks, fruit juices were rare and seasonal, and drinks like coffee or tea were still centuries away from reaching Europe. This reliance on ale and wine meant that medieval people were likely in a constant state of mild intoxication, or at least a slight buzz. Compared to modern standards, it wasn't about getting drunk every day, but about consuming a safer, if less hydrating, fluid. The alternative was risking terrible illness. The phrase, ale for breakfast, wasn't a joke, it was a practical necessity. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this reliance is the archaeological evidence of widespread brewing infrastructure, e.g., kilns for malting barley. Large ceramic vessels found in medieval towns and villages across Europe. Almost every household or community had the means to produce ale, demonstrating its centrality as a fundamental, safe beverage. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval monastic orders, renowned for their brewing, sometimes used herbs like gruit, a mixture of herbs instead of hops to bitter and preserve their ale, giving it a distinctive, often unappetizing, taste. Imagine your beer tasting like a handful of various bitter garden weeds. It's a flavor profile that definitely wouldn't fly today. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of weak ale primarily contributed to a lower incidence of waterborne diseases compared to what it otherwise would have been. Or if the constant, low-level alcohol consumption had its own subtle, negative long-term health impacts on the population. Did it save lives, or just make them slightly tipsy and still unhealthy? Regardless, every sip you took in the Middle Ages was a compromise, a balance between thirst and survival, making your daily drink a far cry from a refreshing glass of clean water. So, your daily thirst was quenched by weak ale or questionable water. This constant negotiation with the available food and drink reveals a deeper, more pervasive issue: the lack of nutritional knowledge, hidden deficiencies. Poor health. Medieval people, lacking any understanding of vitamins, minerals, or balanced diets, were often unknowingly suffering from chronic malnutrition and a host of health problems stemming directly from their limited and repetitive food choices. Imagine your understanding of food. You knew that eating kept you alive, and that some foods made you feel stronger, while others made you sick. But the concept of a vitamin or a mineral was entirely beyond comprehension. You wouldn't connect the bleeding gums and fatigue you experience symptoms of scurvy with a lack of fresh vegetables, or the bone deformities in children rickets with insufficient sunlight and certain nutrients. These ailments would be attributed to bad humors, divine displeasure, or simply the natural course of a hard life. It's like playing a complicated video game without knowing any of the cheat codes, or even what a health bar is. As we discussed, the peasant diet, while often providing enough calories, was severely lacking in variety. The heavy reliance on grains and legumes meant a deficiency in animal proteins, essential fats, and a wide spectrum of micronutrients. Imagine never getting enough vitamin A, leading to night blindness, or not enough iron, causing chronic fatigue and anemia. These hidden deficiencies wouldn't manifest as dramatic illnesses, but as a pervasive, low-level unwellness, making you constantly tired, susceptible to infection, and less resilient to physical strain. even the diets of the wealthy, while abundant in meat and fine bread, often lacked sufficient fiber and the full range of vitamins found in fresh produce. While they might not suffer from scurvy, they could experience other issues like gout from excessive meat and ale consumption or various digestive problems due to a lack of dietary balance. Their perceived rich diet often meant overindulgence in certain categories rather than true nutritional balance. Children were particularly vulnerable. The lack of varied nutrients in infancy and early childhood, combined with unsanitary conditions, meant that many did not survive to adulthood, or grew up with stunted growth and chronic health issues that we now know are linked to early malnutrition. This general ignorance of nutrition meant that food choices were driven by caloric necessity, cultural habit, seasonal availability, and social status, rather than any informed understanding of what the body truly needed to thrive. When illness struck, remedies would focus on purging, bleeding, or herbal concoctions, rarely on dietary adjustments. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this lack of nutritional understanding is the widespread belief in the four humors theory of medicine, this ancient Greek concept, which dominated medieval medical thought, posited that health depended on the balance of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Dietary advice was given based on balancing these humors, e.g., hot foods for cold people, rather than on any scientific understanding of nutrient content, directly influencing food choices away from true nutritional benefit. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval medical texts sometimes recommended eating specific foods to cure ailments based purely on their appearance or symbolic meaning, rather than any physiological effect. Imagine eating walnuts to cure a headache because a walnut looks like a brain. It's a charmingly misguided approach to health. Historians still argue whether the medieval diet, despite its apparent deficiencies, was robust enough to sustain a working population that performed intense physical labor, or if the chronic malnutrition it caused significantly contributed to lower life expectancies and widespread health problems. Did they thrive, or just barely survive regardless? You would live your medieval life perpetually on the edge of nutritional inadequacy, your body silently struggling against unseen deficiencies that undermined your health day by day. So, your body was silently struggling against unseen nutritional deficiencies. And speaking of things that were unseen, or more accurately, tasted in minute, precious quantities, let's turn to spices and exotic goods status symbols. Not common flavor. Forget generously sprinkling cinnamon on your oatmeal or adding a dash of turmeric to your curry. In the Middle Ages, spices were not about making food taste exciting for the masses, but about proclaiming your wealth, power, and prestige. Imagine the journey of a single peppercorn. It had traveled thousands of miles from India, through dangerous trade routes, changing hands countless times, each merchant adding their markup. By the time it reached Europe, it was worth its weight, sometimes literally, in gold. These weren't commonplace ingredients, they were rare, expensive commodities, often locked away and guarded like jewels. It's like using a tiny diamond as a seasoning on your mashed potatoes. For the vast majority of medieval people, spices were simply unattainable. Your food would be seasoned with salt, perhaps some locally grown herbs like parsley, sage, thyme, or rosemary. If you had a garden or could forage them, the pungent, earthy flavors of your daily pottage and bread were the norm, untouched by the exotic aromas of the East, if you were among the elite. However, spices were a display. A noble's kitchen might use black pepper, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and saffron in their dishes, but often they were used in quantities that would seem excessive to modern palates. not always for nuanced flavor, but to show off. Imagine a dish where every spice in the pantry was thrown in, just because you could afford it. It's a bit like a medieval more is more approach to seasoning. Beyond flavor. Spices were also believed to have medicinal properties and were used as preservatives, though their efficacy for preservation was often overstated compared to salt. The very act of importing them also brought cultural and symbolic value, linking the wealthy European elite to the mysterious, distant lands of the Orient. The Crusades, for all their geopolitical impact, inadvertently increased European exposure to Eastern spices, leading to a greater demand and, eventually, more established trade routes. However, they remained prohibitively expensive for most, their cost reflecting the risk and distance of their journey. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the value of spices is that pepper was sometimes accepted as a form of currency or payment in medieval contracts and rents. This demonstrates its immense economic worth, far beyond that of a mere culinary ingredient, underscoring its role as a valuable commodity and status symbol. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval sumptuary laws which, remember, dictated what certain social classes could consume sometimes specifically restricted the use of certain expensive spices to the nobility, further reinforcing their role as markers of elite status. Imagine there being a law that says only rich people can put cinnamon on their porridge. It's a very specific, and rather absurd, form of class distinction. Historians still argue whether the high demand for spices in the Middle Ages was primarily driven by their perceived medicinal benefits and preservative qualities, or if their social and symbolic value as luxury goods for display was the predominant factor in their immense cost and limited accessibility. Did they want to be healthy, or just show off regardless? Your medieval dining experience would rarely be enlivened by the exotic touch of faraway lands, reminding you that true flavor and culinary adventure were the exclusive domain of the very rich. So, exotic spices were out of reach for most, a tantalizing whisper of distant luxury. But beyond the limitations of class and trade, another powerful force profoundly shaped your medieval diet. Fasting and religious restrictions. Lent, meatless days, hunger, Christianity, the dominant religion, imposed strict dietary rules throughout the year, turning food consumption into an act of piety, penitence, and, often, deliberate hunger. Imagine your culinary calendar. It wasn't just dictated by the seasons, it was governed by the church. Meat, and often animal products like eggs and dairy, were forbidden on Fridays. During the entire 40 days of Lent, and on numerous other holy days throughout the year, which could add up to more than 150 meatless days annually. This meant that for large portions of the year, even if you could afford meat, you couldn't eat it. It's like being on a perpetual, religiously mandated diet, but without the benefit of knowing what foods are actually good for you. Lent was the most significant period of fasting, starting on Ash Wednesday and lasting until Easter. This was a time of serious deprivation. You would be expected to abstain not only from meat, but often also from eggs, dairy, and even animal fats. Your diet would shrink to fish often salted or dried, vegetables, and grains, for the poor, already living on the edge of subsistence. Lent was a period of genuine hunger and hardship, pushing them to the brink of starvation. Imagine facing 40 days of even less food. After already living a life of scarcity, these dietary rules were rooted in spiritual beliefs about penance, purification, and remembrance of Christ's suffering. Eating meat, especially red meat, was associated with indulgence and sin, while fish was seen as a humble, acceptable alternative. The very act of abstaining from desirable foods was considered a virtuous act, a way to demonstrate devotion and discipline. The enforcement of these rules varied, but for most, especially in devout communities, adherence was expected. Breaking a fast could be considered a sin, requiring penance. This constant shift between feast when permitted and famine during fasts meant your body was continually adjusting to different levels of caloric and nutritional intake. Even for the wealthy, Lenten restrictions posed a challenge, forcing their chefs to be creative with fish, vegetables, and fruit, sometimes leading to elaborate mock meat dishes made from fish or vegetables to simulate forbidden foods. This highlights the desire to circumvent the spirit of the law while adhering to the letter. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the Church's influence is the medieval concept of fish days versus flesh days. This distinction permeated medieval life, affecting everything from market stalls to household meal planning. Rivers and coastal areas saw a boom in the fishing industry to meet the immense demand for fish during these extensive fasting periods. Fundamentally shaping the medieval economy and diet, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval texts contain detailed debates among theologians about what exactly constituted meat for fasting purposes. For example, were beavers considered fish because they lived in water? What about puffins, which were seabirds? These strange, often humorous, debates reveal the lengths people went to both adhere to and cleverly interpret religious dietary laws. Historians still argue whether these extensive religious fasts primarily contributed to better public health by forcing people to consume more fish and plant-based foods, or if they often led to increased malnutrition and susceptibility to disease, especially among the poor. During periods of prolonged deprivation, did they make people healthier, or just hungrier, regardless? Your medieval plate was not entirely your own. It was constantly under the watchful eye of the Church, imposing periods of enforced culinary austerity that tested both your piety and your endurance. So, your meals were constrained by religious dictates, forcing periods of enforced austerity, and, when you could eat, the practical reality of cooking methods and equipment opened fires. Simple utensils meant that even the most ambitious medieval meal involved immense labor, smoke, and incredibly basic tools. A far cry from the convenience of modern kitchens. Imagine your kitchen. If you were a peasant, it would be the central hearth of your single-room home, an open fire burning directly on the earth floor. There would be no chimney, just a hole in the roof for smoke to escape mostly. You'd have a large iron cauldron or pot suspended over the flames for making pottage, a griddle for baking simple flatbreads, and perhaps a spit for roasting small pieces of meat. It's like trying to cater a banquet using only a campfire and a few rusty pots you found in the shed. The constant smoke would fill your lungs, stinging your eyes and coating everything in a fine layer of soot. Cooking was a smoky, dirty business, and the risk of accidental burns was ever present. Imagine perpetually smelling like a bonfire, every single day. For a noble household, the kitchen would be a separate, often enormous building to prevent fire and contain the smoke. It would feature massive open hearths, large spits turned by servants or sometimes even by dogs on treadmills, called turnspit dogs, and ovens built into the walls for baking. While larger, the fundamental principles were the same: cooking over direct flames or in hot ovens. Without precise temperature control, simple utensils were the norm. Knives, spoons often made of wood or horn, and serving ladles would be your primary tools. Forks were largely unknown in medieval Europe until much later, and even then, were initially viewed with suspicion or as an effeminate affectation. You would eat primarily with your hands, using bread as a scoop. Imagine tackling a roasted bird or a hearty stew with only a knife and your fingers. It's messy, to say the least. Storage was also basic. Foodstuffs would hang from rafters to keep them away from pests, or be stored in sacks and barrels. There were no sealed containers that kept food pristine. Everything was exposed to the elements and the ever-present threat of vermin. The sheer labor involved in cooking was immense. Grinding grain for flour, kneading dough by hand, constantly stoking the fire, stirring enormous pots of pottage for hours. Every meal was a significant physical undertaking. There were no quick meals, no prepackaged ingredients. Everything was made from scratch, from raw materials, often harvested by your own hand. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates the basic nature of cooking is the prevalence of the open hearth in medieval homes across all social strata for centuries. This central fire served not just for cooking, but also for heating and lighting, making it the focal point of domestic life but also a source of constant smoke and fire risk. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval recipe books from wealthy households contained instructions for roasting large animals whole, including their fur or feathers, which would then be removed before serving, sometimes with the animal being redressed in its skin or feathers for presentation. Imagine roasting a whole pig, fur and all, then peeling it off like a giant sausage casing. It's definitely not a cooking method you'd see on a modern culinary show. Historians still argue whether the simplicity of medieval cooking methods primarily led to a relatively healthy, unprocessed diet, or if it limited culinary creativity and ultimately contributed to the monotony and occasional unpalatability of their food. Did it keep them healthy? Or just bored regardless? Every meal you ate in the Middle Ages was a product of immense labor and very basic technology, a testament to the sheer physical effort required just to put sustenance on the table. So, every meal was a product of immense labor and basic technology, often consumed using your bare hands. And those hands, along with the rest of your mouth, would bear the visible brunt of this harsh culinary reality, bringing us to the dreadful truth of dental health impact coarse food. Bad teeth. Forget sparkling white smiles and pain-free chewing. Your medieval mouth would likely be a landscape of worn-down enamel, missing teeth, abscesses, and constant pain, directly attributable to the tough, gritty, and unprocessed nature of your daily diet. Imagine the state of your teeth. From childhood, you would be chewing on incredibly rough, unrefined foods, that coarse peasant bread. Remember, it wasn't just tough. It often contained fragments of millstone grit and husks from inadequately sifted flour. Every bite was like chewing on tiny pieces of sandpaper and gravel. This constant abrasion would relentlessly wear down the enamel of your teeth, flattening their surfaces and exposing the more sensitive dentin underneath. It's like using your teeth as a permanent sandpaper factory, where your mouth is the unhappy machinery. Sugary foods, the bane of modern dental health, were rare for most medieval people. However, while you might avoid cavities from refined sugars, the sheer mechanical stress of your diet would cause a different kind of damage. Your teeth would literally be ground down over your lifetime. Imagine having perfectly flat molars, worn smooth from decades of chewing rough grains, beyond abrasion. Missing teeth would be a common sight. Tooth decay, while less prevalent than today due to less sugar, still occurred, especially in those with access to more refined foods. More often, though, teeth would be lost due to infection, the constant presence of food debris. combined with poor oral hygiene toothbrushes and toothpaste were centuries away, led to gum disease and abscesses. An infected tooth could cause agonizing pain, eventually leading to the tooth falling out or requiring a painful extraction, likely performed by a blacksmith or a barber with no anesthesia. Chronic dental pain would be a part of your daily life. An exposed nerve from worn enamel, an aching abscess from an infection, or the sharp pain of a loose tooth. These were realities you just had to endure. Eating would become a challenge, forcing you to chew on one side of your mouth or avoid certain foods altogether. Imagine trying to eat your tough, gritty bread with a throbbing toothache. The impact wasn't just on eating. Poor dental health could lead to wider systemic infections, as bacteria from abscesses spread through the bloodstream, contributing to general ill health and even death. Your mouth was a gateway for infection, and it was constantly under assault. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this is the skeletal evidence from medieval cemeteries. Archaeological studies of medieval human remains consistently show severe dental attrition wear, high rates of tooth loss ante mortem, meaning before death, and evidence of abscesses and jawbone infections, particularly among the common population. The bones literally tell the story of a diet that ravaged their teeth. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval dental remedies included bizarre concoctions, like applying ground beetle shells or even burnt mouse entrails to aching teeth, demonstrating their desperate attempts to alleviate pain without any scientific understanding of the cause. Imagine someone suggesting you put a dead mouse on your sore tooth. It's a testament to the sheer agony they endured. Historians still argue whether the robustness of medieval jaws, often noted in skeletal remains, was primarily an evolutionary adaptation to their tough diet, allowing them to chew despite the wear, or if the severe dental wear itself led to significant malnutrition in later life as individuals struggled to properly chew food. Did their jaws adapt, or did their teeth just suffer regardless? Your medieval smile would be a grim testament to the hardness of your diet, a landscape of painful wear and early loss, making every bite a challenge and every meal a potential source of quiet agony. So, your teeth were likely a wreck, a testament to the brutal coarseness of your diet. This constant physical toll, combined with the underlying scarcity, often led to a feast or famine mentality binging, then starving. Medieval eating habits weren't about consistent, balanced nutrition. They swung wildly between periods of excess and desperate deprivation, profoundly impacting both health and psychology. Imagine the annual cycle. After a successful harvest in autumn, there might be a brief period of relative abundance. Grains were plentiful, animals were slaughtered for preservation, and fresh produce was at its peak. You might eat larger portions, perhaps even more varied foods than usual. This was a time for celebrating, for replenishing your body after the lean summer months. It's like having a brief, indulgent vacation from your usual diet. But knowing the return to reality is going to be exceptionally harsh. But this feast was always temporary, as winter deepened. And especially towards the end of winter and early spring, the hunger gap we mentioned, food supplies would dwindle. Your diet would become increasingly restricted. Portions would shrink, and genuine hunger would set in. You would consume almost anything to survive, pushing your body into a state of semi-starvation. This period of famine wasn't always a full-blown, catastrophic event like the Great Famine, but a predictable, annual struggle for survival. This cycle of binging and starving had significant health consequences. The body, constantly adapting to wildly fluctuating food availability, would experience stress. Periods of feasting could lead to digestive upset from overconsumption, while periods of scarcity would deplete energy reserves, weaken the immune system, and make you highly susceptible to disease. It's like putting your body through a yo-yo diet every year, but with much higher stakes, psychologically. This constant swing between abundance and deprivation would foster a deeply ingrained anxiety about food. You would learn to eat as much as possible when food was available, instinctively hoarding calories against the inevitable lean times. There was no concept of portion control or moderation when facing potential starvation. Every meal was a race to fill your stomach, just in case the next one never came. This behavior was a rational response to an unpredictable and often brutal food environment, even for the wealthy, while their famines were less about starvation and more about the monotony of preserved food. They still experienced fluctuations. Their feasts were grander, their periods of scarcity perhaps less severe, but the underlying mentality of indulging when possible, due to the general uncertainty of supply, persisted. One mainstream historical fact that demonstrates this cyclical eating pattern is the annual rhythm of medieval agricultural life, directly reflected in farming calendars and seasonal tasks. The success or failure of the harvest dictated the entire year's food supply, creating predictable periods of plenty after harvest and scarcity late winter, early spring for virtually everyone. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval recipe books from noble households explicitly mention preparing dishes for fasting days that were incredibly rich and elaborate, using expensive fish and ingredients that skirted the letter of religious law. Imagine preparing a meat-free meal that's more decadent than a modern steak dinner. Just because you can't eat beef that day, it highlights a very human desire to make deprivation less deprived. Historians still argue whether this feast or famine mentality primarily contributed to the resilience of medieval populations by adapting them to hardship, or if it was a significant factor in their generally poorer health and shorter lifespans compared to later periods. Did it toughen them up, or just wear them down regardless? Your medieval life was a constant dance between abundance and scarcity, a never-ending cycle of filling your belly only to face the inevitable gnawing of hunger once more. So, your eating habits swung between overconsumption and deprivation, driven by the unpredictable nature of food supply and when an animal was available. Particularly for those with limited resources, no part of it would go to waste, leading us to the often gruesome reality of animal products and their use, every part utilized. Little waste. Forget modern sensibilities about prime cuts. In the Middle Ages, an animal was a precious resource, and ingenuity and necessity ensured that virtually every ounce, from snout to tail, bone to blood, found a purpose. Imagine a butchering day. It wasn't just about getting the steaks. When an animal was slaughtered, be it a pig, a cow, or even a chicken, the process was a meticulous, nose-to-tail operation. Every organ, every bit of fat, every bone, and every drop of blood was considered valuable and destined for consumption or use. Nothing was discarded if it could provide sustenance or serve a practical purpose. It's like a medieval version of reduce, reuse, recycle. But the recycle part usually involves eating it. Blood was collected and used to make blood puddings or black puddings, mixed with grains or fat and spices if you were wealthy enough, and boiled or fried. Imagine a dark, rich, savory sausage made primarily from congealed blood, a highly nutritious, if unappetizing to modern tastes, source of iron and protein. Offal, the internal organs, were highly prized. Liver, kidneys, heart, lungs, and brains were all consumed. They were often boiled in pottage or roasted. Even intestines were cleaned and used as casings for sausages or consumed directly. Tripe stomach lining was a common foodstuff, particularly for the poor, who would boil it for hours to tenderize it. Bones were not thrown away. They were simmered for hours, sometimes days, to create rich broths and stocks, extracting every last bit of flavor and nutrient, including marrow. The marrow itself, a fatty and nutritious substance, would be eaten directly from larger bones, even after boiling. Bones might be ground down and added to animal feed. Fat was rendered down and used for cooking, preserving, or even making candles and soap. Lard pork, fat, and tallow beef or mutton fat were crucial sources of calories and were much more common for cooking than butter or olive oil for the majority of the population. Imagine every dish having a slightly greasy, rich consistency from animal fat. Even less appetizing parts, like the feet, ears, and snout, would be boiled or roasted. Pig's trotter's feet and pig's head were common peasant dishes, providing gelatinous textures and concentrated flavors. The entire animal was seen as a gift, and wasting any part of it would have been considered a sin, a profound act of disrespect for the resource and the effort involved in obtaining it. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this practice is the ubiquity of medieval recipes for haggis-like dishes across Europe, which involved cooking various animal organs like heart, liver, lungs mixed with oats or barley inside a stomach casing, while often associated with Scotland. Similar dishes were widespread, showcasing the medieval dedication to utilizing every edible part of an animal for nourishment. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval butchers would often sell specific parts of an animal like pluck, meaning heart, liver, and lungs as a single, cheap cut for the poor, demonstrating the economic necessity of consuming these less desirable, but nutritious, bits. Imagine asking your butcher for the pluck. It sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but it was just a daily shopping trip. Historians still argue whether the medieval practice of utilizing every animal part primarily contributed to a more sustainable and less wasteful food system compared to modern practices, or if it was simply a grim necessity born from widespread scarcity and the inability to afford or waste any potential calorie source. Was it eco-conscious, or just desperate regardless? Your medieval dining experience, particularly with meat, was a raw, visceral reminder that every animal had to provide its full worth, ensuring that little to nothing was ever truly thrown away. Now, let the lingering scent of stale bread, the distant crackle of an open hearth, and the phantom ache of a medieval tooth gently fade from your awareness. The heavy, coarse garments are loosening. The crowded village market is receding, and the constant gnawing of hunger is replaced by a profound sense of fullness and ease. There's no more worry about spoiled meat, no more dread of a meager harvest, no more strict fasting days to endure here. Just the soft hum of your fan, the gentle warmth of your blanket, and the quiet comfort of your room. You can release the imagined burdens of that grim medieval diet, the constant scarcity, the dubious hygiene, and the relentless culinary monotony, that demanding culinary landscape, with all its challenges and its surprising resourcefulness, belongs to history, not to your peaceful present. Drift now into a deep, untroubled rest, sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.